He never thought the land would become a problem. For years, it had been the quietest thing in his life. It sat far from the noise of the city, away from busy roads and crowded neighborhoods. It was not flashy land. It was not famous. It was just land that had been passed down through family, slowly, carefully, with paperwork done the right way. The kind of land people forget about because nothing dramatic ever happens there. The land stretched wide and open. Some parts were flat, some slightly uneven, shaped by years of wind and rain. Old boundary markers stood where they always had. They were not pretty, but they were clear. Wooden posts, metal stakes, survey flags left from long ago. Everything about the land said one simple thing. This place already belonged to someone. He lived far away most of the year. Work had taken him to another state. Life moved on, as it often does. The land stayed behind, waiting quietly. He paid the property taxes every year without fail. The receipts went into a folder that stayed locked in a small fireproof box. The deed was there too, wrapped in a protective sleeve. He was not careless with important things. He never had been. Every few months, he would check county records online, just to be safe. The land was still listed under his ownership. No changes. No notes. No alerts. Everything looked normal. There was no reason to worry. Then one afternoon, a call came from a number he did not recognize. He almost ignored it. Normally, unknown numbers meant sales calls or wrong numbers. But something made him answer. The voice on the other end sounded unsure. It was someone who lived near the land, a person who had walked along the fence line many times before. The caller asked a simple question that did not feel simple at all. "Do you know what's happening on your property?" At first he thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had mistaken the location. Maybe the caller was confused. He asked what they meant. The answer came slowly, carefully, as if the caller was trying not to cause panic. "There are trucks. Big ones. Construction trucks. They've been there for days now." He felt a tight pull in his chest. Trucks did not belong on his land. No one had permission to be there. No leases. No agreements. Nothing. He opened his laptop immediately and searched for recent satellite images. The images were not updated enough to show activity from the last few days. That only made things worse. He tried to stay calm, telling himself there had to be a logical explanation. He called the county office. After being transferred twice and placed on hold, someone finally answered. He gave his parcel number and asked if there had been any changes. "No changes on record," the clerk said. "You're still the listed owner." That should have been comforting. Instead, it raised more questions. He asked if any permits had been issued for construction on the land. There was a pause. The clerk typed something into the system. "I do see permits," the clerk said slowly. "Residential construction permits. Multiple units." His heart dropped. "How many?" he asked. Another pause. 96, the clerk replied. He could not speak for a moment. 96 homes was not a small mistake. It was not a single shed or fence built too close to a line. It was a full neighborhood. He asked who requested the permits. "The homeowners association tied to the nearby development," the clerk said. "They submitted plans months ago." No months. All this time, while the land sat quietly in his mind, someone else had been planning to cover it with houses. He booked a flight that same night. When he arrived 2 days later, the sight felt unreal. Where open land had once stretched out, there were now rows of wooden frames. Roads were being carved into the soil. Heavy machines moved back and forth like they had every right to be there. Workers walked around with clipboards and helmets. It looked organized, confident, permanent. He parked on the side of the road and just stood there for a while, watching. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. To them, he was just another passerby. The sound of machinery filled the air. The smell of dirt and fuel mixed together. The land felt different now, busy, taken. He walked closer until a temporary fence blocked his path. A sign was attached to it, listing the name of the development and the homeowners association managing it. There was no mention of his name. No acknowledgement of the true owner. He asked a worker who was in charge. HOA management, the worker said casually. They've got all the approvals. That word echoed in his mind. Approvals? From whom? Certainly not from him. He drove straight to the HOA office. The building was modern, clean, and confident. The kind of place that expected people to listen when they spoke. He introduced himself at the front desk and asked to speak to someone. It's about a serious issue involving land ownership. After a short wait, he was led into a meeting room. A few representatives sat across from him. They were calm, almost bored. He explained, slowly and clearly, that the land under construction belonged to him. He told them he had the deed, the tax records, and the survey maps. He said there must have been a mistake. One of the representatives leaned back in their chair. Our records show the land as part of our expansion zone, they said. We have permits. Everything was approved. He asked to see proof of ownership transfer. They did not provide any. Instead, they talked about zoning changes, development plans, and internal maps. They spoke in circles, using confident language without showing a single document that transferred ownership. He asked them to pause construction until the matter was resolved. They refused. Stopping now would cause serious losses, one of them said. If you believe you own the land, you can take legal action. The message was clear. They were not going to stop. He left the office feeling stunned, but not defeated. Anger tried to rise, but he pushed it down. Anger would not fix this. Proof would. That night, he opened the fireproof box for the first time in years. He laid everything out on the table. The deed, the tax receipts, old surveys, letters from the county. Everything was there, exactly as it should be. As the machines continued working on his land, he made a decision. He would not shout. He would not threaten. He would let the truth speak in the only place that mattered, court. And as the sun set over the half-built homes, he knew this was only the beginning. The next morning did not feel real to him. He woke up in a small hotel room near the edge of town, staring at the ceiling for a long time before moving. Outside, cars passed like it was any normal day. People were going to work. Kids were getting ready for school. Life was moving forward while his land was being changed forever. He got dressed slowly and drove back to the site. He wanted to see everything clearly, not just from a distance. As he approached, the noise started again. Engines. Metal hitting metal. Voices calling out instructions. The land no longer felt quiet or patient. It felt rushed. He parked and walked along the edge where the temporary fence ended. No one stopped him. No one asked who he was. Workers were focused on their tasks, following schedules and plans that had nothing to do with ownership. To them, this was just another job. He noticed how far the construction had already gone. Foundations were set. Wooden frames stood in neat rows. Some houses already had roofs. This was not a small operation that could be undone easily. Someone had spent a lot of money here, and they were confident they were allowed to do so. He took photos with his phone, not for drama, but for memory. He wanted proof of the progress, proof of the timeline. Every picture felt heavy. Later that day, he returned to the HOA office hoping to speak with someone higher up. This time, the tone was different. He was no longer seen as a confused outsider. He was now an inconvenience. He was brought into another meeting room. The same calm faces greeted him, but there was less patience in their eyes. He repeated his claim carefully. He explained again that the land had never been sold, never leased, never transferred. He offered to show the deed right there. One representative shook their head slightly. "We don't need to see that," he said. "Our legal team has already reviewed everything." That answer bothered him more than an argument would have. It meant they were choosing not to look. He asked a direct question. "Can you show me the document that says this land is yours?" They avoided the question. They talked about zoning approvals, development plans, and city cooperation. They spoke about how common these expansions were, how land lines sometimes shifted on planning maps. Maps, he realized, were not deeds. He asked again for construction to pause. He explained that once homes were finished and families moved in, the situation would become much more complicated. They refused again. "You're free to take this to court," one of them said almost casually. "But construction will continue." There was no anger in their voice. That was the worst part. They spoke as if the outcome was already decided. He left without raising his voice. He knew better. Losing control would only hurt him later. That evening, he sat alone and went through every document he had brought. He called a local attorney the next morning. The attorney listened carefully, asked questions, and then paused. "If what you're saying is true," the attorney said, "this is serious." They met in person later that day. The attorney reviewed the deed, the tax records, and the surveys. Everything checked out. Ownership had never changed. The attorney explained something important. Permits allow construction, but they do not give ownership. A city can approve plans, but it cannot give away private land. That explanation brought a small sense of relief, but it did not solve the immediate problem. The houses were still going up. The attorney advised patience. Filing too early without full preparation could backfire. The HOA would likely argue that he waited too long, or that he allowed construction by not stopping it. Forcefully, he understood the risk, but he also knew he had never been notified. Silence was not permission. Over the next few weeks, he returned home, but his mind stayed with the land. He received updates from neighbors almost daily, photos, short messages. Videos of progress. Walls went up. Windows were installed. Roads were paved. Streetlights appeared. It was painful to watch. Sometimes, late at night, doubt crept in. He wondered if the system would protect him, or if power and money would win. He wondered how a mistake this large could even happen. But every time doubt grew too strong, he opened the fireproof box again. The deed was still there, clear, legal, undeniable. Months passed. The HOA moved quickly. Marketing signs appeared. Homes were listed for sale. Buyers walked through model houses, imagining futures built on land that was never meant to be sold that way. He felt conflicted. He did not blame the buyers. They trusted the system, just like he once had. His attorney began building the case quietly. They requested records from the city. They reviewed the permits line by line. What they found was simple but powerful. The permits approved construction plans, not land ownership. The HOA had never submitted proof that they owned the land. They had relied on an internal planning map that was never officially recorded. That map became the center of everything, while the legal groundwork was being prepared. Construction reached its final stages. 96 homes stood where open land once existed. Families began moving in. Each move-in felt like another layer of weight. Added to the situation, the attorney warned him that the HOA would try to argue fairness. They would say it was too late, that undoing the development would harm innocent people. He understood. This was no longer about tearing anything down. It was about truth and responsibility. By the time the lawsuit was officially filed, the neighborhood looked complete. Clean streets, fresh paint, new fences. From the outside, everything looked perfect. From the inside, the foundation was cracked. He knew the road ahead would be slow and uncomfortable, but he also knew one thing for sure. The land had never stopped being his, and eventually, a judge would have to look at the same document he held in his hands, the deed, as winter approached. The case moved forward quietly. No headlines, no public drama, just paperwork, filings, and waiting. He learned patience in a new way. Not passive patience, but active waiting, preparing. Watching every day the home stood there was another reminder that truth does not always stop wrongdoing quickly. Sometimes it waits for the right moment, and that moment was getting closer. Time stopped feeling normal after the case was filed. Days still passed, but they felt heavier, slower, as if each one carried extra weight. He returned to his regular life, but nothing felt routine anymore. Every morning began with the same thought, and every night ended the same way. The land stayed on his mind like an unanswered question that refused to fade. He kept working, kept answering emails, kept showing up where he was expected to be. To anyone watching from the outside, he looked calm and focused. Inside, he was constantly replaying conversations, rereading documents in his head, and imagining how things might unfold. He learned quickly that waiting during a legal process was not passive. It demanded patience, control, trust in facts rather than emotion. Updates from the attorney came in steady but quiet waves. There were filings, responses, requests for records, and official letters sent back and forth. None of it felt dramatic. There were no raised voices, no public scenes, no sudden victories. Just a slow building of truth, piece by piece. Meanwhile, life on the land continued without him. The neighborhood had fully come alive. Families moved in, cars filled the driveways, children rode bikes on streets that had not existed a year earlier. Lights turned on at night, glowing warmly through windows. From a distance, it looked like a place built with care and hope. That sight caused a strange mix of feelings. He felt anger toward the system that allowed this to happen, frustration at the HOA for refusing to pause, and sympathy for the people who had no idea they were living in the middle of a legal storm. He never blamed them. They were not responsible for checking deeds and county records. They trusted that someone else had done that work. He avoided the area as much as possible. Seeing it too often made it harder to stay steady. Still, there were moments when he drove past, slowly, just to remind himself that this was real and not some misunderstanding that would fade away on its own. During one visit, he stood at the edge of the road and watched people unloading groceries, greeting neighbors, laughing. It struck him how quickly land could change meaning. What had once been open and quiet now held dozens of separate lives, all connected by a mistake that none of them caused. Back home, he focused on preparation. The attorney asked for more background information, not because ownership was unclear, but because context mattered. They wanted to show a full picture of responsibility and neglect. He provided everything he could remember. When the land was inherited, how often he checked records. How taxes were paid on time, every time. The attorney also gathered records from the city, emails, meeting notes, approval forms. What they revealed was unsettling but not surprising. Departments had worked in isolation. Planning approved designs, permits approved construction schedules. No one confirmed ownership at the deepest level. Everyone assumed someone else had already done that. Assumptions, he learned, could cost millions. The HOA's defense began to take shape as well. Through official responses, they claimed they acted in good faith. They pointed to permits, zoning discussions, and internal development plans. They suggested that delays in raising objections implied acceptance. It was a careful argument, designed to shift responsibility rather than deny facts. The attorney explained this calmly. "They're not saying you didn't own the land," they said. "They're saying you didn't stop them fast enough." That idea bothered him deeply. He had never been notified. He lived far away. The moment he found out, he acted. Still, the system had a way of twisting silence into consent if not challenged properly. This was why Part 3 of the process mattered so much. This was the phase where patience became proof, where his behavior would be examined as closely as the documents. He followed every instruction carefully. He did not contact residents. He did not speak publicly. He did not confront the HOA again. Everything went through legal channels. It was difficult, but necessary. Months passed like this. Winter turned to early spring. Grass began growing around the new sidewalks. Trees planted by the HOA started to take root. The neighborhood felt settled, then came depositions. He had never experienced anything like it before. Sitting in a quiet room, answering questions under oath, knowing every word mattered. The questions were polite but persistent. They asked about timelines, awareness, intent. They asked why he did not visit sooner, why he did not stop construction physically. He waited. He answered honestly. "I didn't know," he said. "And when I did, I followed the law." That answer stayed consistent, no matter how they tried to frame the question. He did not exaggerate. He did not soften the truth. He trusted that consistency mattered. The HOA representatives were questioned as well. Their answers were careful. They spoke about planning meetings, development goals, and assumptions made based on maps. When asked about the deed, their responses grew less confident. They referred to legal teams and past practices rather than direct proof. The contrast became clear. One side had a document that never changed. The other had explanations. During this time, the emotional toll became heavier. There were nights when sleep did not come easily. He would wake up thinking about worst-case outcomes. What if the court decided fairness mattered more than ownership? What if compensation was delayed? What if responsibility became so spread out that no one truly answered for it? On those nights, he reminded himself why he stayed calm. Panic would not help. Anger would not help. Facts would. He stayed grounded by keeping life simple. Morning walks. Quiet meals. Limited news. He spoke to only a few people about the case, choosing those who listened more than they spoke. One conversation stood out. A close friend asked if he regretted not stopping construction immediately. He thought about it for a long time before answering. If I had tried, he said, I would have been treated like a problem. By waiting, I became a fact. Spring moved forward. The case reached a critical stage. Motions were filed. Arguments were outlined. The attorney explained that the judge would soon review the core evidence. This was when preparation shifted into anticipation. He revisited the deed again, holding it carefully as he had many times before. The paper was slightly worn, but the writing was clear. It carried authority, not because of emotion, but because of history and law. It represented continuity, ownership uninterrupted. He thought about the people who had owned the land before him, who had trusted systems and records. He felt a responsibility to honor that trust, not just for himself, but for them. Outside, the world continued moving. The neighborhood planned community events. Seasonal decorations appeared. Life adapted quickly to its surroundings. Inside the legal process, things slowed again. Judges took time. Reviews took time. Silence returned. This silence felt different from before. It was no longer empty. It was filled with preparation, already done. When the attorney finally called with the update, the tone was steady. The judge has requested to see the original deed, they said. There was no celebration. No sudden relief, just a quiet understanding of what that meant. This was the moment everything had been moving toward. He ended the call and sat still for a long time. Outside the window, the day looked ordinary. Sunlight filtered through trees. Birds moved freely. Soon, the deed would sit on a desk in a courtroom. Soon, it would speak for itself. And for the first time since the trucks arrived, he felt something close to peace. Not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the truth had finally reached the right place. Whatever came next would not be based on assumptions. It would be based on what was real. The day of the court. Hearing arrived without drama. There were no crowds, no cameras, no loud voices waiting outside. It was just another working day in a building that saw conflicts come and go. Still, for him, it felt like the most important day of his life so far. He arrived early, dressed simply. Nothing flashy, nothing meant to impress. He wanted to look like what he was, a person who trusted facts more than performance. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet. A few people sat on benches scrolling through phones, whispering or staring at the floor. Everyone there carried their own story, their own problem that needed solving. His attorney met him there and greeted him with a calm nod. There was no speech about winning or losing, just a reminder to stay steady and answer clearly if asked. That advice had guided him for months, and he held on to it now. When the doors opened, they walked inside together. The room was larger than he expected, but plain. Wooden benches, a raised desk for the judge, flags placed neatly to one side. Nothing in the room suggested emotion. It was built for order, not drama. The HOA representatives were already there, seated across the room with their legal team. They looked confident, organized, and calm. Papers were stacked neatly in front of them. Laptops were open. Everything about their posture suggested preparation and certainty. He reminded himself that confidence did not equal truth. The judge entered, and everyone stood. When the judge sat, the room settled into silence. The case began. At first, the discussion felt distant, almost technical. Legal language filled the room. Dates were mentioned. Filings were referenced. The judge asked questions that showed careful attention but no bias. It was clear this was not rushed. Every detail mattered. The HOA's attorney spoke first. They explained the background of the development, the permits, the planning meetings, and the belief that the land was part of an approved expansion area. They described the construction of 96 homes as a project completed in good faith. Their argument rested heavily on process and intention. They suggested that stopping construction would have caused widespread harm and that delays and objection implied acceptance. They spoke smoothly, carefully choosing words that framed the HOA as responsible and cooperative. He listened without reacting. He had heard these points before. Hearing them now, in this room, felt different, but not overwhelming. When it was his attorney's turn, the tone changed. There was no long introduction. No emotional appeal. The attorney focused on one simple truth. Ownership had never changed. They presented the deed. The document was placed in front of the judge with care. It was not dramatic. No one gasped. But the room felt different the moment it appeared. The judge examined it closely. Page by page, line by line. The attorney explained the history of the deed, how it had been recorded, updated, and maintained over time. They showed tax records that matched the ownership exactly, year after year. No gaps, no transfers. The judge asked the HOA's attorney a direct question. Where is the document that transferred ownership of this land? There was a pause. The response did not include a deed. Instead, HOA's attorney referred to internal maps, planning approvals, and zoning discussions. They argued that the system had treated the land as part of the development area. The judge listened, then asked another question. Is there a recorded document that shows this land was legally transferred? Again, there was no clear answer. He sat quietly, hands folded, heart steady, but alert. This was the moment he had imagined countless times, yet it felt strangely calm. The facts were finally being placed side by side. The judge asked about notification. Had the landowner been informed? Had consent been requested? The answer was no. The HOA argued that permits were publicly available and that construction was visible. The judge responded with a simple statement. Visibility is not consent. Words stayed with him. The discussion continued for hours. Questions were asked. Clarifications were requested. At one point, the judge asked him directly to confirm details about his awareness and response timeline. He answered plainly. He did not exaggerate. He did not defend emotionally. He stated facts. When he learned of the construction, when he contacted the HOA, when he sought legal advice, the judge listened without interruption as the hearing went on. It became clear that the case was not about intent, but responsibility. The HOA may not have meant to take land unlawfully, but intention did not replace verification. The judge requested additional documents from the city, emails, approval records. The court took a recess. During the break, he stepped outside into the hallway. His attorney stood beside him. Neither spoke much. There was nothing left to add. When the court resumed, the judge returned with a focused expression. The room felt smaller now, more concentrated. The judge summarized the findings carefully. Ownership had never transferred. Permits did not grant land rights. Failure to verify ownership before construction was a serious oversight. The judge acknowledged the complexity of the situation, especially with families now living in the homes. This was not a matter of simply undoing construction. It was a matter of accountability. The ruling was delivered calmly. The land was confirmed to belong to him. The HOA was found responsible for constructing on land they did not own. Further proceedings would determine compensation and resolution There was no celebration in the room. No raised voices. Just acknowledgement. He felt a release he had not allowed himself to feel before. Not joy, but relief. The truth had been recognized, as people gathered their belongings and began to leave. The HOA representatives avoided eye contact. They were no longer confident. They were thoughtful. Outside the courthouse, the sky looked the same as it had that morning. Cars passed. People walked by, unaware of what had just happened inside. His attorney shook his hand. "This is a big step," they said quietly. He nodded. He knew it was not the end, but it was the turning point. Later that day, he sat alone and reflected. Not on victory, but on how easily systems could fail when assumptions replaced verification. How important it was to keep records, to stay calm, to trust process. He thought about the families living on the land. The ruling was not against them. It was for the truth. The deed rested safely once again in his possession. It had done what it was meant to do. Soon there would be negotiations, decisions, and long-term solutions. But the hardest part was over. The judge had seen the deed. After the court confirmed the truth, life did not suddenly become easy. There were no fireworks or loud moments of celebration. Instead, there was a quiet shift. The kind that happens when something heavy is finally put down after being carried for too long. He felt lighter, but also tired in a deep, honest way. The days that followed were filled with meetings and calls. Not rushed ones, not emotional ones, but careful conversations about what came next. The ruling had settled the main question of ownership, but it did not magically solve everything else. 96 homes still stood on land that legally belonged to him. Families still lived there. Roads, lights, and systems were all in place. Reality could not be erased with a single decision. He approached the next phase the same way he had approached everything else. Calm, patient, focused. On facts rather than feelings, the HOA reached out through legal channels. Their tone had changed. Where there had once been confidence and dismissal, there was now formality and caution. They no longer spoke as if the outcome was obvious. They spoke as people who understood they had made a serious mistake. Negotiations began quietly. The goal was not to punish, but to resolve. The court had made it clear that responsibility rested with the HOA. Now the question was how to correct the situation without harming people who had done nothing wrong. He made one thing clear from the start. He did not want families dragged into conflict. They had bought homes believing everything was legal. They deserved stability, not fear. This position surprised some people. There were those who expected anger or demands that would cause disruption. But he had never wanted revenge. He wanted acknowledgement, accountability, and fairness. The attorney explained the options carefully. Compensation for the land. Long-term agreements. Adjustments that respected both the ruling and the reality on the ground. None of it would be simple, but all of it was possible. As talks continued, he visited the area one last time, not to inspect or confront, but to observe. He walked along the sidewalk, blending in with everyone else. No one recognized him. No one needed to. He watched children playing near driveways. He saw neighbors talking across fences. Life had taken root there, regardless of how it began. Standing there, he felt no bitterness. Only a quiet understanding of how easily systems could fail when speed replaced care. How important it was for someone to slow things down when truth was at risk. Back home, he reorganized the fireproof box. The deed went back inside, placed carefully where it had always belonged. It no longer felt like a weapon or a shield. It was simply what it had always been. Proof. Weeks passed, then months. Agreements were reached step by step. The HOA accepted responsibility publicly through formal channels. Compensation was arranged. Legal ownership was respected. The process did not erase the past, but it corrected the future. Occasionally, people asked him if the experience had changed him. He thought about that question often. It had not made him harder. It had not made him suspicious of everyone. What it had done was remind him that calm persistence mattered, that records mattered, that silence did not mean weakness, and patience did not mean surrender. He returned fully to his normal routine. Work felt steady again. Sleep came easier. The constant weight in his chest faded into memory. The land, though changed forever, was no longer a source of stress. It was simply part of his story now. It's a chapter that proved something important. Truth does not always shout. Sometimes it waits, and when it finally speaks, it does not need drama. It only needs to be seen. The judge had seen the deed, and because of that, everything found its place again. The months after everything settled were quieter than he expected. There was no sudden return to the way life used to feel before the construction, because too much had changed for that. Instead, a new normal formed slowly. Built on routine and reflection rather than urgency, he noticed the change most in small moments. Mornings no longer started with checking messages from the attorney. Evenings were no longer spent rereading documents or thinking through arguments that might never be needed again. The mental noise that had filled his days faded, leaving space for ordinary thoughts. People around him noticed it too. He seemed lighter, more present. Not happier in an obvious way, but steadier. The kind of steadiness that comes from knowing a long problem has finally found its end. Occasionally, updates still arrived. Final paperwork. Confirmations. Official records being corrected. Each notice was brief and factual, and each one felt like another door closing gently behind him. Nothing dramatic, just completion. One afternoon, he received confirmation that the land records had been fully updated to reflect the ruling and the agreements that followed. The language was formal and precise, but the meaning was simple. What had always been true was now unquestionable in every system that mattered. He printed the document and placed it in the fireproof box with the rest of the records. Then he closed the box and locked it, not because he was afraid of losing anything, but because order felt right again. He thought often about the people living on the land, not with worry, but with curiosity. How their days unfolded. How their routines formed around streets that once did not exist. How children would grow up there without ever knowing the full story of how close everything came to going wrong. That thought no longer bothered him. In a strange way, it brought comfort. The land had taken on a new purpose, even if it was not the one he had imagined. Ownership, he learned, was not just about control. Sometimes it was about responsibility and restraint. He was asked more than once why he never spoke publicly about the case. There were opportunities. People suggested interviews, articles, even public talks about property rights. He declined them all. To him, the story was not about attention. It was about process, about what happens when systems move too fast and someone chooses to slow them down without shouting. When he did speak about it, it was only in private conversations, usually when someone asked for advice. He always said the same things. Keep your records. Check them. Do not assume someone else is doing their job. And when something feels wrong, stay calm and act deliberately. He never framed himself as a hero. He never framed the HOA as villains. Life, he believed, was rarely that simple. Mistakes happened. What mattered was how they were corrected. On a quiet weekend, he drove past the neighborhood again. Not to inspect or judge, but simply to pass through. The streets were familiar now. Clean. Lived in. He parked for a moment and walked along the sidewalk. A few people passed by, nodding politely. He nodded back. Just another person enjoying a calm day. As he returned to his car, he felt something settle inside him. Closure, perhaps, or acceptance. The land had taught him something he would carry forward. Truth does not need to rush. It only needs to endure. And sometimes, enduring quietly is the strongest thing a person can do. Time kept moving, even after everything else had settled. That was something he learned clearly once the legal noise faded. Life did not pause to recognize closure. It simply continued, steady and quiet. It's asking to be lived again. He found himself thinking less about the case and more about the kind of person he wanted to be after it. Not because he felt changed at the core, but because long struggles always leave small marks. They teach lessons, whether a person asks for them or not. He became more careful with details. Not in a fearful way, but in a respectful one. He read documents slowly, double-checked things he once trusted without thought. It was not distrust. It was awareness. At work, he noticed he listened more than he spoke. Problems that once felt urgent now seemed manageable. After watching something so large unfold over time, smaller issues lost their power to overwhelm. Sometimes people around him complained about delays, paperwork, or rules. He understood their frustration, but he also understood why those systems existed. Rules were not perfect, but without them, mistakes became disasters. One evening, organizing old files, he came across photos from before the construction began. Wide open land, quiet space. Nothing built. He stared at them longer than he expected. There was no sadness. Just memory. The land in those photos no longer existed in that form, and that was okay. What mattered was that the truth of its ownership had been respected in the end. Change itself was not the enemy. Carelessness was. He thought about how isolated his situation could have ended differently if he had reacted with anger instead of patience. If he had shouted instead of documented, if he had rushed instead of waited, those thoughts reinforced something important. Calm was not weakness. It was strategy. From time to time, he received messages from people who had heard parts of the story through quiet channels. Friends of friends. Professionals who dealt with land or planning. They asked how he stayed steady. He never gave dramatic answers. I trusted records, he would say. And I trusted time. That answer often surprised people. Many expected talk of clever tactics or bold moves. But the truth was simpler than that. Facts do not panic. They wait. He carried that idea into other parts of his life. Disagreements felt less personal. Delays felt less threatening. He learned to separate emotion from action. On another drive through the neighborhood, he noticed how the area had matured. Trees were taller. Yards looked lived in. The place no longer felt new. It felt settled. He parked briefly and sat in the car, watching the ordinary movement of life. Someone walked a dog. Someone else watered plants. A delivery truck passed slowly. No one there knew the full story, and that was fine. The purpose of the truth was not recognition. It was correction. As he drove away, he realized something else. The experience had given him confidence, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing he could handle uncertainty without losing himself. That confidence stayed with him. Not his pride, but his balance. The land, the case, the waiting, the outcome, all of it became part of a larger understanding that life does not reward the loudest voice. It responds to the clearest one, and clarity, he learned, comes from patience, honesty, and the courage to let truth take its time. Life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Not perfect, not untouched by memory, but balanced. He learned that balance did not come from forgetting what happened. It came from understanding it without letting it control the present. There were moments when the story returned without warning. A news article about land disputes. A casual conversation about development projects. Even a simple drive past an empty field could bring back the early days of confusion and disbelief. But those moments no longer carried tension. They passed through his thoughts like clouds, noticeable but harmless. He noticed how his sense of time had changed. During the hardest months, every day felt stretched. Waiting felt endless. Now weeks passed quickly again. Plans felt normal. The future felt open. One quiet evening, he sat at his desk and wrote a short list. Not for legal reasons. Not for work. Just personal notes. Lessons he did not want to forget. He wrote about patience. About preparation. About staying calm when others rushed. About trusting documents more than assumptions. He did not write about anger. He did not write about winning. Those things did not matter anymore. What mattered was that he had stayed true to himself throughout the process. He had not allowed pressure to turn him into someone he did not recognize. That realization brought a quiet sense of pride. The kind that does not need to be shared. From time to time, He received updates from the attorney, even though the case was long resolved. Minor administrative matters. Final confirmations. Each message was shorter than the last, till eventually there were none. Silence returned fully, and this time it was peaceful. He began spending more time outdoors. Long walks. Quiet drives. Moments where his mind could wander without being pulled back by stress. He noticed details he had once ignored. The sound of wind. The way light changed through the day. These small observations grounded him. They reminded him that life was larger than any single conflict. No matter how consuming it once felt. One afternoon, he ran into someone who lived in the neighborhood built on his land. The interaction was brief and polite. A simple exchange about the weather. The person had no idea who he was or what role he had played in the history of that place. And that was exactly how it should be. The goal had never been recognition. It had been resolution. He walked away from that interaction with clarity. The land now held stories that were not his alone. It carried many lives, many routines, many futures. His role had been to protect truth long enough for those futures to exist without its uncertainty. That was enough. As months turned into another year, the experience settled fully into the past. It no longer felt unfinished. It no longer needed revisiting. The story had reached its natural end, not with noise, but with understanding. And in that understanding, he found something more valuable than victory. He found peace.